It's been a little while since I spoke about the situation in Ukraine, and it's a situation I feel very strongly about because I have close ties to the local Ukrainian community here. But it's always on my mind. I'm going to be speaking specifically about the phenomenon of Kenyan volunteers fighting on the Russian side, and I'm also going to read out part of Liai. But a brief look at some of the recent developments. There was a horrific drone attack in the city of Ternopil in western Ukraine, not the east, not near the battlefields, but in western Ukraine. It killed about 25 people and others were injured. There was also renewed drone attacks in Kharkiv and other cities. This shows the Kremlin's depravity. It just shows that they really, really don't give a damn about killing civilians. They've been doing it for years in Ukraine, and it just adds to Putin's war crimes. Um, I mean, obviously, it sickens me, but it is what it is. It's just very, very important that these things are known to the public. Because one of the biggest issues with this war, and we've seen it with other major modern conflicts, is it becomes a propaganda war. And in the past, like in conflicts in the 1990s, that would have been from news networks. But today we see it all played out on the internet. You know, you see a report about Ukrainian civilians killed in a drone attack, and instead of concerned comments and comments condemning Russia, you get laughing emojis. I mean, I hate to say this, but it's true. You get laughing emojis, and you get people actually repeating Kremlin propaganda and pouring scorn on the victims. It absolutely disgusts me, but that's the reality of modern conflicts. It's also true of other prominent conflicts, Gaza and Israel and Sudan, but particularly with Ukraine and the Middle East, I think. I'm just going to read out part of the IS reports regarding the situation on the ground and also the Kenyan volunteers. I'm just going to make a point regarding foreign volunteers. Um, it could be argued that, particularly in the case of countries outside Europe, there are similar motivations for money and for getting out of poverty and other issues. That's often been why young men have joined war in the past. Um, but there's some interesting statistics. For example, the highest proportion of foreign volunteers apparently to have fallen in Ukraine, you would think it was a European country. It's actually Colombians. Now, Ukraine doesn't publicise its own casualties, but regarding volunteers, there are sites that look at that, and I came across one recently, and this was, really detailed, went into each individual's name. Most of them had photographs. Over 600 Colombians. 600. For a country that is thousands of miles from Ukraine and has no obvious connections, direct connections. There may be a Ukrainian diaspora in Colombia, but surely I would have thought that its connections were significantly less in European countries. So to see that 600 Colombian guys have laid down their lives for Ukraine is incredible. In the case of the UK, it's about 43. Now, as far as I'm concerned, every volunteer is a hero. Um, to put your life on the line and to potentially lay down your life for a country that isn't yours, but to see the higher cause, to me that is genuinely heroic. This is not to trivialize loss. This is not to say that it's something that people should be gung ho about or take lightly at all. I wouldn't for a second trivialize that. But I do think of the other side. I almost feel sorry for those volunteering for Russia, because whilst those volunteering for Ukraine, I believe, have the moral argument. They're defending a country that was brutally invaded, whose civilians have been under a brutal assault. What argument do those joining the Russian side have? What do they have? It's a pay packet, if they even get that. I mean, there is no moral argument for it. Maybe they're anti-NATO. Maybe they're anti-West. But the sad truth is they're just being used as cannon fodder is perhaps an archaic term, as cannons are not used anymore, but they're being used for Putin's war, and that to me is such a waste. For a young Indian guy or a young Kenyan to die on the battlefields of Ukraine, or a North Korean for that matter, for what? For dictators who don't care about them. In the case of with the North Koreans, I'm thinking of Kim Jong Un and Russia, of course, Putin. That is really a waste. And in that process, they may well be targeting Ukrainian civilians. What sort of legacy is that? Whereas on the other side, those who laid down their lives, still tragic, but they at least were doing it for a noble cause. This is not, again, I'm not trivializing war in any way, shape, or form, but this is not just two squabbling neighbours. I believe that the liberation of Ukraine, I believe the fight against Russian aggression is a moral cause. And quite frankly, I thought about going out there myself, but they started tightening the rules. You had to have actual military battlefield experience, which I don't have. So that didn't go ahead. I don't say that lightly. I don't say that to be braggadocious, but I'm making the point that it's that's how I felt about it. Now I'm going to read out piece from the Eye. This is by Mark Galliotti, and it's not the whole report. It's abridged, but it gives us an update to the situation on the ground. Even while Ukrainian and Russian soldiers fight a close quarters battle for the city of Pokrovsk, their countries are increasingly focusing their strategies elsewhere. This is a war fought in people's wallets, in their darkened and unheated apartments, and against their morale. The Russians are pounding Ukraine's power stations, substations, gas pipelines and electricity grid nightly. On Sunday, most of the country experienced up to 16 hours of power cuts following an especially large attack involving 45 missiles and 850 drones. Not to be outdone, Kyiv has continued its own campaign of smaller but still effective strikes against Russian power infrastructure and in particular petrol facilities. This has also led to localised power cuts and contributed to a spike in fuel prices. It is a clear sign that both sides fully appreciate that the war will ultimately be won or lost not simply on the battlefield but in the will of respective leaderships and peoples. By relying on volunteers rather than conscripts or mobilised reservists, Vladimir Putin has been trying to shelter most Russians from the realities of the war, but petrol shortages and price rises affect everyone, and social media makes it clear that despite efforts to explain them away as a result of market volatility and unplanned seasonal maintenance of refineries, no one really buys this. As one taxi driver from the Siberian city of Irkutsk complained, the Ukrainians can't reach my city with drones, but they're certainly bombing my bank account. Russia's size and the need to defend Moscow and a handful of other politically significant centres mean it's impossible to secure every potential target. That's actually one of Russia's weaknesses. Its sheer size is ironically a weakness. How do you defend a country that big all the time? I've said before the Ukrainians do need to be careful to avoid civilian casualties because whilst they have overwhelmingly been the victims of Russian aggression, if Russian civilians died in Ukrainian strikes, it would become, that will obviously be weaponized and used against Kyiv, unjustly so, because this has been a war of aggression on Ukraine, not the other way around. But they must maintain the moral high ground, hard as that is. This is a report I've been reading from. It's from the 13th of November. Now, the piece on Kenyan fighters, I'll just read that out. This is by Humphrey Malalo. Kenya said yesterday that more than 200 of its citizens are fighting for Russia in Moscow's war in Ukraine, and that recruiting agencies are still actively working to lure more Kenyans into the conflict. Ukraine last week said that more than 1,400 citizens from 3 dozen African countries are fighting alongside Russian forces in Ukraine, with some recruited through deception. Russia was enticing Africans to sign contracts that Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha described as equivalent to a death sentence, and urged African governments to caution their citizens. Moscow's embassy in Nairobi did not immediately respond to a request for comment. According to the ministry, Kenya's embassy in Moscow has recorded injuries among some of the recruits who were allegedly promised up to $18,000 to cover costs for visas, travel and accommodation. I mean, if you're a Kenyan, it's not a wealthy country. That's a very enticing offer. I know that President Ruto has called on Zelensky to free Kenyan nationals who may be prisoners of war. I think that if Zelensky gets calls like that, he should put pressure on the respective governments. Okay, we'll free your fighters if you publicly condemn Russian aggression. I think, he should bring it to them. there is a tragic side to this. These guys are clearly being misled. I heard also about Indian students in Russia being basically press ganged into the Russian military. And the thing about Russia itself is a lot of the middle class and, let's say, more advantaged members of Russian society are being somewhat shielded from the war, because the thousands and thousands and thousands of Russian dead, like we've seen so many times throughout history, they're coming from the poorer echelons of society. They're coming from Siberian outposts. You know, these guys are. It's just a tragic thing. I mean, I almost sympathise with them. I say almost. I have no sympathy for anyone committing war crimes, but they're being used. They're being used by Putin. And whilst Ukrainian soldiers will be remembered as heroes defending their country, where's the glory in an 18-year-old Russian from some Siberian village who's been killed in Ukraine fighting for a dictator? You know, in a war of aggression, where's the honour there? It's a little bit like Americans who died in Vietnam, but on an even bigger scale. You know, American casualties in Vietnam were about 58,000 over, what was it, 13 years? We'll never probably know the true figures for Russia's casualties, but the cited figure of 1 million casualties, including injuries, is possible, given the intensity of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And even if that's an exaggerated figure, we know that tens of thousands of Russians have been killed and wounded. So it's a massive human cost. The cost of Ukraine, of course, their infrastructure, their people, civilians, the cultural genocide. That's what it is. You know, trying to eradicate Ukrainian culture. This is what's happening. The power cuts too. I mean, something like a drone attack with civilian casualties is graphic. It's horrific, but that's a very visual thing. We don't see the everyday struggles that people are facing, for example, with power cuts that we in other parts of the world take for granted. You know, a 16-hour power cut here would be a real headache. It would be a real inconvenience. I mean, imagine that on a frequent basis. A 1 hour power cut here is an inconvenience. 16 hours, you imagine that. So it goes without saying, I'm with Ukraine 100%. I don't think this war is going to end anytime soon, and I think that in a way, for the Russian side, Putin's got himself into a situation he can't back out almost, because he's now propped up the nationalists in his own midst, in the sense that if he withdraws, they would deem Putin to be weak and they could turn on him. So as much as, you know, you can argue morally, of course you should, but you can't really factor morality into a dictator. It doesn't come into the equation. So we think in practical terms, and Putin will be thinking, what's practical? I can't back out because I've promised we're going to, you know, liberate Ukraine from its Nazi government. So he's got himself into a rut. It's possible his health isn't great. It's possible, you know, Putin's in his 70s. Traditionally, Russian leaders haven't lived that long. Gorbachev was an exception. He made it to 91. But most Russian leaders die in their 60s and 70s. So who knows? Maybe Putin's health isn't great. But even if Putin was to die of natural causes, who fills the vacuum? I do wonder if it's possible that Russia itself will just completely fragment like the Soviet Union did. Perhaps Russia is just too big for its own good. So sadly, there's no sign of this ending anytime soon. It is reassuring that the White House has toughened its stance, but I still wouldn't entirely trust Donald Trump, unfortunately. Yes, he's toughened the language. Yes, he's starting to see that Putin is a barrier to peace, but even with full American support, Russia has backers as well. But I would say that for foreign volunteers captured by Ukraine fighting on the Russian side, if their respective governments call for the release, I think Kyiv should put pressure on them. If it's India, if it's Kenya, he should publicly say, okay, we will repatriate your citizens on condition that you publicly condemn Russian aggression and cut off any support to Russia. Like, really put that sort of premise to any sort of deal. That's what I would do if I was Zelensky. because these guys are being misled into it. It's tragic on one hand, but it also emboldens the Russian side at the price of Ukrainian civilians. As for all the useful idiots online and the Putin cheerleaders, frankly, words can't sum up how I feel about those people. Sometimes they're in Western countries, sometimes they are in African and Asian countries, and I can't get my head around why a South African or a Kenyan or an Indian would repeat Russian propaganda. The only thing I can think of is they have hostility to the West, so they don't really care what Putin's like. They don't care that he's a brutal dictator. It's more convenient to just back Putin because of their own anti-West worldview. But it's so important that the truth is put out there, because this is a propaganda war and no one should underestimate Russian poison. You know, that's what it is. The tentacles of Russian disinformation spread far and wide. And sadly, a lot of people are taken in by it. But the Ukrainians know the truth. Demoralized Russian soldiers know the truth. Their mothers and widows hopefully know the truth. Recently, Putin was embarrassed by a little girl asking about her uncle who was wounded on the front line. Putin, you could tell he was trying to evade the answer. He just called the guy a hero, but he evaded the little girl's question about getting good treatment. Apparently, so I don't know how long Putin can hide this from the Russian people. There will, of course, be an element, probably a majority of the Russian population that see Ukrainians exactly how they are vilified. But there is Russians who know the truth. There are Russians who bravely, in my view, stand up to Putin at a real risk of being in prison or worse. But in all honesty, they are the minority. Most Russians do find it easier to just go with the nationalist thing. But I've said before, how much of that is authentic is always hard to know in dictatorships. The same in China. Some of it could be putting on a face, we have to back the president to sort of push back against the West. But I remember there was some pranksters put a poster of Putin in a lift somewhere. I think it was in St. Petersburg. Might have been in another city. But anyway, rather than saying, oh, there's a picture of a wonderful president, people were swearing. They were saying, literally, what is this shit doing here? Who put this up? Things like that. That's not exactly symbolic of an endearing population. So Putin's time will come, whether it be from natural causes, whether he's removed in a coup, whether it's, I don't know, could be something else. He could end up like Assad, being forced into exile, although I think that's less likely. This can't go on forever, but how does it end? I don't know. I honestly don't know at this point, but that's the situation.